All right.
So my name is Andrew Doss. I just want to again thank everybody for being here. Um, this is a really trying time for everybody. It's also a time of great creativity and excitement. I've been lucky to see a lot of things happening and a lot of new creative energy come up. Um, and I wanted to call on the four people who are here today to speak with each other about what they're observing. I've been observing a few things that I think are important that I'll just start off with, which is that I see that the whole world is facing 5 new realities as part of something we're calling the Future Louisiana Network. We'll be discussing how these 5 new realities are impacting the whole world and how Louisiana is on the front lines. The 5 new realities are increasing inequity, climate change, exponential technology, that's automation, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, all the things we're doing right now, virtual work, new patterns in globalization, and suddenly pandemics, which affect all of those. So I've asked everybody who's on the call here just to think together a little bit about their own observations. So I'd ask you to each introduce yourself, and along with introducing yourself and what you do, please tell us in a couple sentences how your people came to Louisiana, how your family came to Louisiana. And secondly, something you inherited from them and want to pass on to the next generation. But first, introduce yourself.
Why don't we go with the secretary first?
Yes, please, Secretary Robinson, why don't you begin? I'm sorry.
Well, thank you all. I thought you all were just going to say ladies go first, so I figured I was going first. So I'm Kimberly Robinson. I am the Secretary of the Department of Revenue for the state of Louisiana, and I am a Baton Rouge girl, although some people will say Zachary since I live in the suburbs. I've also spent time living in New Orleans, so I get to claim both cities. And maybe I should just call myself an I-10 girl, because sometimes I spend more time on I-10 than I do in either city. Since the beginning of March, I've spent more time dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic than necessarily my day job of being Secretary of Revenue, but I have a great team and they have been backfilling for me at Revenue. And I've been focusing on everything that goes with dealing with the pandemic, working with the governor here at the Office of Homeland Security as we work day in and day out to address what is facing our state. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you. Secretary Robinson, would you just sharing how your family came to Louisiana and something you inherited from them that you want to pass on to the next generation?
So both sides of my family are from Louisiana, and strong sense of family and strong work ethic are things that I inherited from my family. My grandparents are all deceased. My grandmother worked her way up from the maid at a jewelry store, which is now a Zales store, but she worked her way up from maid to being the manager. And in that role, I mean, what she taught was just tenacity and never stopping. My grandfather owned his own business, but also worked every day at the post office and went to run his business at night. And so just that hard work ethic, that's what they taught. And from what they taught, that's what I want to pass on to the next generation. Hard work and continuing to move forward. That was what was instilled in me, in my parents, and what I want to pass on to the next generation.
Thank you, Secretary Robinson. Quentin Messer, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Quentin Messer Jr. How I came to Louisiana. I'm not a native, unlike the secretary and Flozell. I think Jan is also someone who came here professionally. I came for professional reasons. I'm a native of Jacksonville, Florida, so I'm a Southerner. So I have part of that. Um, Something that I would pass on to the next generation. Our family has moved around a lot, and what I admire about Louisianans, and particularly New Orleanians, I lead the economic development organization in New Orleans, is that powerful sense of place. People in Louisiana and in New Orleans are incredibly rooted in this place. And it's a place that's easy in which to fall in love and feel as if you are part of something bigger than yourself. And I've lived in New York, I've lived in Illinois, I've lived in Pennsylvania, lived in Ohio. As I mentioned, I'm a native Floridian, but I've never felt such a powerful sense of place. So I hope the next generation feels that way. And I guess the secondary thing is, um, and we're going to talk about it later on, is I do feel as if we have to be better on the other side of this tragedy in order for it to have meaning. So I do think Louisianans always are pressing to be better. And I think that's very praiseworthy. Thanks.
Thank you. Jan Moller, why don't you introduce yourself? Oh, I'm afraid you're on mute, Jan.
I forgot. I had unmuted. Okay. My name is Jan Moller. I'm the executive director of the Louisiana Budget Project. We're a research and advocacy organization based in Baton Rouge that looks at state fiscal policies with a particular eye on how they impact low and moderate income families in Louisiana. And we kind of operate on the assumption that state policies, state budget and tax policies really play an important role in people's lives and can be a force for good and can be a force for ill, and that it can be used to really lift people up. And if we make the right investments in the right way, that we really can improve people's lives and give them the tools to be more successful, and we can reduce some of the barriers, particularly the racial barriers that have held this state back over generations. My background, I came to Louisiana in a Subaru, drove here from Las Vegas in 2003 to take a job with the New Orleans Times-Picayune to cover state government. I was originally born in Sweden. I'm an immigrant to this country. I arrived on a Pan Am flight in 1978 when I was 9 years old with my mom and my stepdad. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I spent much of my youth in Washington, D.C., and then moved to Las Vegas and then came here. I wasn't expecting to stay here for it's been 17 years now, but Louisiana has become my home. It's where my wife was born. It's where my children are born. And I think what I really appreciate about Louisiana is the sense of rootedness that people have. People from Louisiana really love Louisiana in a way that, everybody likes where they're from, but I think Louisianans especially love Louisiana. And that makes it an easy place for me to love and for my family to love. So, this is not where I expected to be, but I'm very happy to be, because I can't think of a place, there's so much opportunity here, and we just need to make the right choices.
Thank you. Flozell, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Good thing. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Flozell Daniels. I'm the CEO of the Foundation for Louisiana, where we invest in people and practices that really make the state stronger and reduces vulnerability. We've been privileged to do this work for nearly 15 years now. Come September, it'll be 15 years. And we've had a chance to work across Louisiana with some of the most amazing people in shifting systems level policy and creating change and opportunity, really along the lines that Jan spoke of: expanding economic opportunity, diminishing racial disparities, expanding affordable housing, decriminalizing behavior, and depopulating jails. It's just wonderful and difficult work to do. I'm really gratified to be able to do that work and to be in partnership with folks like the ones on this call, because my people actually are Southern folk who originated in Alabama and migrated to Mississippi and then to New Orleans for the purposes of economic opportunity. My grandmother came here and was a person who washed clothes in New Orleans at the historic Jung Hotel, which has recently been renovated and reopened. And she had a vision and a dream that we would really do what the secretary said, work hard, that we would believe in and practice common decency, and that we would enjoy life, culture, and faith, and have a vibrancy. And so I was raised in that kind of environment, in that kind of neighborhood, and eventually have been able to be successful and to really live out the kind of dream that she had. It gives me hope that even with all of the challenges that Louisiana has, that we still can create space and opportunity for people to be successful and to be able to create a life that's a good life. I'm old enough to remember there not being any social media or any of the technologies that we use, but I have a hashtag that's sort of my calling card now, called joy and justice. I believe that it's our birthright to experience joy and to realize justice for everybody.
Thank you all. I've already mentioned kind of my underlying premise for future Louisiana, these 5 new realities that we're facing. But I want to ask you each observations from your personal experience and insight about what you see happening. And so I'm going to ask you to go one at a time, just make one observation, then I'll come back around. So we'll get a quick round, kind of a quick fire round. So 3 observations from your personal experience and insight about what is happening in Louisiana today. Why don't we start again with Secretary Robinson? One observation.
We are learning to live in a brand and brave new world, one in which we rely greatly on technology.
Okay, Quentin, one observation.
We are all much more economically interdependent than we ever realized.
Hey, Jan?
When this is over, we really need to refocus how we invest and how we conduct our education system.
Flozell, an observation.
Our investment in access to health and the attainment of health outcomes is going to be directly connected to our ability to respond to pandemics like this in the future.
Secretary Robinson?
Another observation is that everything is local. Everything is local. We have to start at the local level, the state level, and move to the national level, but it all starts at home. And so what we're seeing is that states and local governments are working together. Mm-hmm. That's the observation.
Great. I notice I'm just drawing a connection, which I'll do throughout as I start to see dots connecting. I'm hearing from you, everything is local, and I heard a moment ago from Quentin, everything is interconnected. And so that's interesting to hold those both up together. Quentin, why don't you give us another observation?
I think mental health and our inability to really fund and address it is an existential threat.
Jan?
I think the public safety net is more important than many people might have realized. We often think of that as something that applies to somebody else, but we are realizing how many people are just a paycheck or a week of missed work away from needing supports in difficult times, and hopefully that safety net will be there for people.
Flozell?
Access to broadband and other technologies that allow us to do distance learning and the kind of meeting and the discussion we're having now is going to have to be considerably more broad spread than I think we originally imagined.
And back to Secretary Robinson, your third observation.
If there's one thing that the pandemic has, and Jan's children speaking right now, one thing that the pandemic and the new world has shown us is how to open our eyes and see everyone around us. We're often so engrossed in our own lives and whatever is going on and what we think is important. We are now all taking the time and we see our families, our children. We see the importance of the people that some of us walk past and never notice. The first responders who are so important, the healthcare workers, the people in the grocery stores and the restaurants. We all have to open our eyes and see everything around us.
Thank you. Quentin.
The first thing that came to mind after trying to listen to everyone is I hope that we will come together as Louisianans, whether we live in northern Louisiana, southern Louisiana, New Orleans, Lafayette, Lake Charles. It's just been my observation that we sometimes forget that those things that make us connected as Louisianans are much stronger than those differences, regardless of where we have the particular address.
Jan?
I think it's really redefined how I think about what essential work really is. We think about first responders. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on the healthcare workforce and the heroic work they're doing. But there are so many other jobs being done that we thought of as low paid and maybe people thought of it as less important, but really are essential work. Home health care aides, for example. Think of how many people are at home depending on a nurse or somebody to come to their house and take care of them. And those are some of the lowest paid jobs. We think of them as low skilled, but they are absolutely essential at this time. So I hope we use time to really rethink what is essential work and we start to reward that essential work like it should be.
Thank you. Flozell, finish out our observations.
Well, I'm thinking a lot about and talking to some colleagues, both locally and across the country, about this ongoing debate about the difference between public goods and private capital. I think there's going to be an increased debate about what should sit on the public goods side, if you will, and what should sit on the private capital side. I think it's rightful time for us to have that conversation in the context of this pandemic.
Thank you. I'm getting a note, by the way, as we move on to the next segment. I'm getting a note that from some people who are asking us if we could just reintroduce ourselves briefly. So for those who've joined recently, I'm just going to say I'm Andrew Doss. I'm a convener for a new initiative called Future Louisiana, which is looking at the long-term decisions that we need to make now, especially with this COVID crisis, for the economy to hand down to our children and grandchildren, and how it can become stronger, more resilient, and inclusive. And I work also as a director of policy and partnerships for a group called Future Tide Partners, which is part of this. If you could each just one sentence introduce yourselves one more time.
Sure, I'll go first. Flozell Daniels with the Foundation for Louisiana, a New Orleans native, and I've had the privilege of working in public policy and community activism work for the last 25 years.
Secretary Robinson, go ahead.
Kimberly Robinson, I am Secretary of the Department of Revenue, and this is my second term serving as Secretary. Been here since 2016.
Jan?
Jan Moller, I'm the Executive Director of the Louisiana Budget Project. I've been in Louisiana for 17 years. The first 8 of those was spent as a reporter with the New Orleans Times-Picayune.
And I'm Quentin Messer Jr. I'm the newbie to Louisiana. I've been here 8 years. I served as Assistant Secretary at Louisiana Economic Development in the prior gubernatorial administration, and been leader of economic development, New Orleans Business Alliance in New Orleans for the last 5 years.
Thank you. And now if we could just, I want to open this up a little bit between the four of y'all. I want to know, what are the burning questions that you have? What are you genuinely perplexed by now? And what are you hoping, what areas are you hoping that solutions will emerge that we don't have yet?
I mean, I think that there are three things that keep me up at night. One is this issue of, and I think COVID-19 underscores it, and I think everybody's discussed it, issue of economic mobility. I think really what we're seeing are those economies that had some diversification and were fundamentally strong, they're going to get out the starting block sooner on the other side of COVID-19 than those economies that were really dependent on those sectors that were most at risk of pandemics, whether it's oil and gas, maritime, tourism, hospitality. And it's not just me saying, this is what science says, and we can see. And so that keeps me up, this issue of economic mobility. The second is making sure that we don't revert back to behaviors before. We should be better. We should be different. We should be more caring. That doesn't mean that we have to walk away from capitalism or free market concepts, but it has to be redemptive. It has to figure out how to work for everybody because we are interconnected. And I think the final thing is how are we, the mental health piece. I really do think that we need to think about helping young people and families deal with underlying trauma. Because there are people in New Orleans who are still dealing with trauma that was untreated, unsolved post the tragedy of Katrina or BP oil spill. Now we have a pandemic that has shaken economic security to its roots, and we have to be sensitive to that. There things, and I guess the final piece is things that we thought were luxuries are not luxuries. I mean, Jan talked about essential workers. Mental health is essential. That's got to be something that we focus upon on the other side.
Thank you. What other questions do people have?
I'll chime in. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about, both in the experience we're having, I mean, we're an organization that was born out of disaster recovery. So we consider ourselves experts, like many of the folks on this call. We've all had the post-Katrina experience. We've done this work. And then you get something like this pandemic that really calls into question what you think you know. And so I've been asking this question the last few days, both in my context as foundation leader and working with hundreds of community partners, and also as chair of the Regional Transit Authority. How do we instill and make sure that the science and public health practice is informing everything we do? Just think about it. A few weeks ago, with the exception of a few folks, no one was thinking, what's going to happen during a global pandemic caused by a virus that forces you to not be with each other, and that forces physical distancing. That means you have to not only consider new ways of doing business and getting your work done, but that also means you have to know enough about the science or have advisors who can keep you and your staff, your partners and your family safe. And so part of the question, or at least the central question I have, is how quickly can we ramp up our awareness and knowledge about those things? All of us are going to have to become sort of jackleg scientists in some ways to understand, does an N95 mask protect you the same way a surgical mask does? Is 6 feet actually enough physical distancing, or do you need 12 feet? This stuff is emerging in real time, and I'm just hoping we can really get a better consensus and collective understanding of what it means for all of us to do our work, because unfortunately it looks like not only is COVID-19 going to be a long-term sort of slow rolling experience, but the scientists are telling us it won't be the last kind of its virus. And we may in fact be having yet another new normal. And I think I just am really struggling to understand how we bring the science into everything we do.
Well,
Feel free to start just all chiming in where you want to, by the way.
well, while Flozell is trying to figure out how we bring the science into everything, my natural inclination is to worry about how we pay for it.
Yeah.
And he's right. We all, or he and I both, come out of disaster experience from Katrina and Rita, and those experiences, and it was a different experience from this one. And we will learn and grow as we move forward. But everything that has been mentioned, Quentin is concerned about mental health and access to mental health services. Those are critical services. If you don't have private insurance and insurance that pays for it, it is something else that the government needs to pay for. The science that goes into how do we protect ourselves against the spread of the virus, what equipment is necessary. I mean, PPE has become just another acronym in my world. It used to, the acronyms that I used to live with were IRS and Form 1040, but PPE is now a new acronym for me. And so how do we pay for the PPE and who sources that PPE? And it has become the role of government, because it's not when we had Katrina or when we had Rita or any other hurricane or storm of that type. It's not a single state or a small group of states that are impacted. We're talking about something that impacts the entire world. All of the continents, except for maybe one, being impacted at the same time, and only so many sources of the PPE and other critical products that we need. So how do you source those products and materials? Can you expect a small rural hospital in rural Northeast Louisiana to still be able to get those items from the vendor that they typically buy from, when the orders for that vendor have multiplied 10,000 times? So it becomes the role of government. And how does government pay for that? How do you balance the need to fund government with the need to ensure that the citizenry, who normally funds government through taxes, can make it from day to day, because you've had the impact of stay-at-home orders, and some of those citizens don't have a job to go to? How do you fund unemployment insurance programs? How do you fund expanded digital learning experiences for public schools? If every child in that school did not already have a laptop, how do you make sure that you're rolling out an educational opportunity that those children can utilize? If we don't all have broadband, how can those children learn? How do you make sure the basic necessities for those children, like school breakfast and lunch, are provided for? Those are things that I worry about and wonder about, and brings into play the inequities that we have in our society that have always been there. They're just always more prevalent when we are dealing with disasters. We see them more clearly, and you have to wonder, what do we do differently to change those things? This pandemic is more of a leveling of the playing field than other disasters, because it's not just a matter of, well, I can afford to do X, because it is not one that says, well, we're only going to strike here. It's everyone needs to figure out what to do next, how to protect themselves. Do I need an N95 mask, or is one that I'm sewing on the sewing machine? And no, I'm not sewing anything on a sewing machine, in case anyone's asking. I was not capable of mastering sewing. My great grandmother tried to teach me, abject failure, can't sew. But for all those people that are sewing masks, is that enough protection? Those are the things that we all have to worry about, or at least I have to worry about. How do I pay for it?
Yeah.
I'm getting a note here, by the way, Secretary Robinson, that says, if you could you lower the screen a little bit? We're having trouble. Some people apparently are having trouble seeing your face.
Oh, but I wanted it that way.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. People want to see you. And you might notice, by the way, I want to that 4 of us are working from home, but Secretary Robinson is in her office. Which I would, if I could piggyback off of that, what you were just talking about, Secretary Robinson, can you give us what you're seeing and dealing with today and yesterday? What's happening there in government offices? What's happening in your office as the secretary? All those burning questions.
So state government offices are closed to the public, but they are open for essential employees to come into work. I don't remember who talked about essential. If it was Jan who talked about who's essential, I think that was Jan's comment about essential workers. The work of government is essential. There are things that must continue, things that have to go on. For the Department of Revenue, it is income tax season, individual income tax season. So for taxpayers that are filing returns that are due a refund, they want to receive those refunds. And for a lot of taxpayers, those refunds are very critical right now. I see Jan raising his hand. He wants to receive his refund. There are some refunds we have in place in Louisiana. We have a early childhood tax credit program that's in place for our early learning centers and for the employees that work in those centers. It's a star rating system. But those refunds right now for those childcare centers that are still operating and for those that need additional cash flow to stay operating, getting those refundable credits out are very important. So I have employees, we have assigned laptops that are working from home who are normally in the office, but they're working from home to process those refunds. Someone has to be in the office to get those checks in the mail. So that essential work is going on. Someone has to be in the office to open the mail for returns that are still coming in by the mail. Our IT people have to be there to make sure the system is running. So those are critical functions that must continue. If you are someone who's waiting to receive a refund, you definitely want the Department of Revenue and the staff here doing that job. I'm at the Office of Homeland Security right now, and in this office, there are representatives from every agency that's involved, from the Department of Children and Family Services to the National Guard, to the Coast Guard, to the Navy. We have naval resources that have come in to provide assistance. The Department of Health is here. Everyone's here that has a role and that's playing a vital role in the response, from ordering PPE, making sure it gets to the hospital where it needs to go, because everything's coming into here and then it's shipped to the appropriate place, be it to cafeteria workers who are providing school breakfast and lunch in school districts around the state, hospital workers on the front line in our hospitals around the state, ordering ventilators. I'm learning more about ventilators than I ever wanted to know, and it's just one of those things that you say, who knew there were so many things about ventilators? But they're all critical things that are going on right now, and we're doing those things. New proclamations, extending stay-at-home orders, suspending laws that need to be suspended, granting certain powers to different agencies that need them. Those are things that have to happen. Someone asked if lawyers were essential, and we say, we don't think we're essential, but from time to time, you do need the lawyers. And there seem to be a lot of us in the room right now. more lawyers than we realize, but the commissioner of administration is a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. The governor is a lawyer, his executive council and special counsel. So we outnumber the rest of the room. There are only 8 of us in that room, but let's just say the communication staff has been outnumbered by lawyers.
Thank you, Secretary Robbins. I'm going to open up to some questions that are coming in on the Q&A, but first I want to make sure, Jan, burning questions that you have.
Well, I think piggybacking on what Secretary Robinson said, I'm deeply concerned about how this recession is going to affect the revenue coming into state government. I think we kind of knew before this happened, and there were reports to the effect that Louisiana was very poorly prepared for a deep recession. That is not casting blame on policymakers, but it's because we have an economy that is, heavily dependent on oil and gas, which has been very vulnerable to recessions, and then of course tourism, and those 2 sectors are hit very hard in this recession. About 2/3 of the state general fund comes from sales taxes and personal income taxes. When people are at home, they're not buying a lot of things, so sales taxes go way down. And when people aren't working, they're not earning an income and they're not having income taxes withheld. So I think we're going to see a huge drop in state revenues. We don't know exactly how big that drop is going to be. And we know that state governments in general are poorly prepared to deal with recessions because unlike the federal government, the state has to balance its budget. And so when recessions hit, the need for public services goes up. There are more people who need Medicaid. There are more people who need public services, and the revenue to pay for it goes down. So we've gone from having a very strong budget to a budget where we don't really know what it's going to look like, but it's going to be a very different picture when the legislature comes back. And I think one reason that this recession is so different from others, when we've had disasters in the past, there has been an economic bounce after that disaster happens because people have things to rebuild. People are rebuilding, after Katrina and Rita, people had to rebuild their homes and buy new cars and new refrigerators and repair their roof. And so there was a lot of economic activity that resulted from the rebuilding process. We even saw it from the floods in Baton Rouge in 2016. When this recession's over, it's going to be a very different recovery because when you're allowed out of your house, you're going to go to dinner, maybe go to a movie, maybe go to the mall and buy some clothes. But you're not going to be doing the same kind of rebuilding. So I don't think we can expect the same kind of bounce. Now, maybe there'll be a little bounce if we have 2 jazz fests within the span of 6 months or something like, there's going to be a demand, people are going to want to go out and do things at some point, but I'm very worried about how this is going to affect the ability of state government to provide basic services at a time when we really need them. Secretary Robinson is more, I'm sure, way more keenly aware of this than I am, but that's the burning question for us right now, and it obviously highlights the need for a strong federal response. We saw, to their credit, Congress has passed 3 bills dealing with this so far, but everything I'm seeing suggests that it's not going to be enough, and that the next wave of stimulus is really going to have to provide more dollars for state government to keep those budgets afloat.
I want to go to some questions that have come up, and I want us to think. I really like the way we're driving towards thinking through what are the long-term issues that we're going to be having from this. So frame any answers that come to you around that. The first question that popped up minutes ago was, what role do you think universities should be playing in all of this? Does anybody want to speak to that?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. New Orleans is an underrated brain magnet. I mean, you have at least 8 institutions that grant 2 or 4 year universities. I mean, 2 or 4 year degrees. So I think our higher education community is going to be critically important. I mean, one of the things that Flozell talked about was the need to integrate science throughout every response. I think that's critically important. I think Secretary Robinson has talked about the need for social science. I mean, one of the things that we found is if you demonize government, if you say, you know, starve the beast, then when you have a pandemic, you don't necessarily have the resources to respond to all the things that Secretary Robinson alluded to. You know, how do kids in rural areas get fed, get educated, broadband access, all these things. And I think Jan has been talking about over the years, in some ways that I agree with a lot, in some ways I disagree with a lot, about the need about that social safety net. And so I think this whole notion that government was intrinsically bad, I think is going to have to require reexamination. And I think higher ed has a way to contribute to the knowledge universe that helps not only the hard sciences, but also the social sciences and how we all perceive what is the role, what is our interconnectedness, what are social classes owe to each other.
If I can push you on, sorry, go ahead, please.
If I could build on that, I think one of the things we know from recessions is that people usually use that time to go back to school and retrain for things. You know, and so I think we're going to probably see that, you know, once we kind of get back into the workforce. And what Louisiana does is we do a pretty good job of making college affordable for traditional college students who come out of high school. And if you do well in high school, you can get a top scholarship and get a affordable for your education. But so many of our students are non-traditional, and people are going back to school who may have families and other obligations and going part-time, or they're going for technical training, or they're going for a certificate. You know, I would anticipate we'd see a whole lot of people who maybe work in restaurants or in the oil field who are rethinking those career choices and maybe thinking about something in healthcare. We're going to see a huge demand for healthcare workers. And it's going to be incumbent on the state to keep that education as affordable as possible. We raised the price of education in Louisiana during the last decade as we coped with the economic fallout from the Great Recession. And I think we should not repeat that mistake, and we should adjust our spending in a way that the people who need help to pay for that certificate or for that retraining have the supports and the ability to access that education without incurring a whole lot of debt.
Well, I think that Jan is on the Board of Regents talking points now with
Unwittingly.
with funding higher education. Andrew, I think you had something that you wanted to chime in on, so I'll let you before I talk about what higher ed is doing.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say higher ed is surprisingly nimble right now. They have worked very diligently as we've had to move from the classroom to online training to make sure that those healthcare students are getting the simulation lab training necessary to still get their credential and be able to go out into the workforce. Graduating our doctors and nurses early so that they can get on the front lines in our hospitals to assist. So making sure that on match day, doctors who are already in medical schools in Louisiana stayed in Louisiana and didn't go to other states. Making sure that we have the training programs in place for the summer and fall for those new career opportunities, looking ahead at what needs to happen, working with the Workforce Commission as the CARES Act has dollars in it for retraining those workers who've been displaced by the COVID-19 virus. Really, how do we make the next step in our education and our workforce training? So those are some things that are already in place and happening and will continue to happen. And I talked to Jan about being on their talking points because we were investing more in education at all levels in the budget that was planned for
Right.
the upcoming fiscal year. We will be looking at what that budget looks like, how much money will be available for anybody, let alone for higher education. But they are making those plans and taking the steps to be visionary in what needs to happen for our citizens and our workforce moving forward. So that is underway currently with the current higher education community. And they're also the ones who are using their 3D printers to print PPE, sending us their PhD students to do modeling with statistical analysis, coming up with ideas on ways that we can do things differently. So they are very engaged and involved in this process.
I'm noting a few questions coming up that I'd like to point out that we've got on this panel, we've got a representative from government, a representative who's here on behalf of the private sector, a representative from the philanthropic sector, and sector. So I'd like to kind of summarize a few questions and ask, what do you all see as the role, especially as COVID is forcing us into private spheres of living, might be one place to start. But what do you see as the differing roles between sectors and how they can cooperate together in building our future economy out of this crisis?
I mean, I'll jump in. Look, I think what we realize is that it's going to take a cross-sector approach. But I guess I guess I'm the private sector person at the Business Alliance. I think there's three things. I mean, one, businesses have to figure out how to get going and pay life-sustaining wages. One of the things that's going to happen is all of us are going to fundamentally probably look at capitalism in a different way. And I think if businesses want to minimize government regulation, government need to sort of regulate, because I think the public will demand that, then they're going to have to figure out how to do that. I think the second thing is, one of the things I think the private sector needs to really think about is the benefits cliff. I know they have to come alongside government and philanthropic sectors and advocacy sectors, because you hear a lot of times people talk about there was this misperception that people didn't want to work, but people are rational economic actors. So I think the private sector has a great chance to sort of help come alongside government to solve this. But on the last thing, I think government has to make sure that they give private sector the oxygen and the space to try to relaunch and get going again as quickly as responsibly can be done, and not make sure that public health and human life is compromised. The most, you can't give people back life or time. And so I think business has to figure out how to be responsive and ready to go, but also make sure that they are partners worthy of the public's trust. Because when public doesn't trust business, that's when you begin to see regulatory overreach and things of that nature that stifle innovation and stifle business growth.
Yeah. I'll jump in. I think it's been interesting, philanthropy's role in responding to disasters, and in addition to the larger conversation of building community, I think it's been, has shown up in a few ways, and I think it's happening now, but in a different way. One, we typically see funders who are interested in stoking innovation, really wanting to answer, to your earlier point, Andrew, the sort of long-term issues around inequity or inequality, how are we going to design and structure policies that serve the greater good? And so, I think what you're finding and will continue to find are efforts to support policy change, systems change, really some particular interest in education and advocacy. I think a lot of the things that we've discussed today and that we'll be working on in the long term, how do we build bridges of understanding between differing folks with differing opinions and factions, both small p and large p politics. I also think philanthropy has a duty to support the organizing and building of power inside of communities that don't have much power, right? I think we have to have some real truthful conversations about why racial inequity exists, how systems have perpetuated systemic racism and racially disparate outcomes, and how important history tells us this story, how important it is to support really thoughtful and strategic work that in the moment feels oppositional, that feels like we're not coming together, but in fact is pushing for and setting forth a new way of practicing democracy and practicing how we support what's in the public good, and so that everybody can do well. And we'll continue to see that. I think even in a pandemic like COVID-19 is causing, you begin to see some fraying around the edges that philanthropy is really interested in engaging with regard to, how do we treat people in prisons and jails when we're having the larger public safety conversation. To the Secretary's point, what in the world do we do to pay for things that before now we decided would be paid for with sales taxes, which is just not going to happen probably over the next year, or fines and fees and other legal financial obligations. It's just not a durable way to do it. I'm seeing philanthropy really try to rally around efforts of not just responding in the moment to COVID-19, but really how do we rebuild systems so that they're better and that we don't go back to what we were doing before. This virus is teaching us that those systems are not durable, they're not sustainable, they won't work to protect us or to build this future for our children and grandchildren that you talked about at the top of the call. And we're really hoping to be a part of engaging in those conversations, supporting that innovative thinking, supporting the education and advocacy efforts that it takes to get us on the same page to move in that direction.
I want to thank you, Flozell, but also want to thank everybody. I'm 3 minutes left. There's so many questions that our wonderful attendees have sent in that have, I'm afraid, and so many questions I want to ask that we won't have time to answer, and let alone ask of each other. I think I'm going to ask to go around now and just give a concluding thought. As we're just getting into the meat of things, what are you leaving this conversation with, or want to communicate to the 55 participants out? We each go around. Secretary Robinson, would you start us off again?
So this is the beginning of this conversation. It's the first one of its kind, and we have to start here. What do we want to see in our future? Everyone thinks that when the stay-at-home order ends, that we magically go back to everything being the way it was before the first case of COVID-19 was reported in the United States. We don't go back to that. Things will start to resemble something that was like that, but we will never go back to the world before this virus. And how we move forward, making good decisions and decisions that will help us in the future to have a sustainable, resilient world. We have to keep having these conversations.
Thank you, Secretary Robinson. Quentin? We have about 1 minute, by the way, so just quick conclusion.
Yeah, very quick. Hey, thank you so much, Andrew, for putting this together. I want to thank fellow panelists. I think just 3 words: hope, audacity, and perseverance.
Thank you. Jan, you're on mute.
So thank you again for doing this. I think Secretary Robinson said the key word that I keep coming back to, and that's resiliency. I think resiliency and ingenuity is going to eventually move us forward. And I appreciate you for starting this conversation.
Thank you. Flozell?
I'll be quick. I'll invoke Angela Glover Blackwell, who first told us that equity is the superior growth model. I think as we move through this in these other long-term conversations, going back to equity and its proven power in helping us be well and be strong is going to be important. And a reminder that fighting for justice is the historic fuel of progress. There is no moment in this country's history or the history of mankind where the fight and the achievement of justice hasn't been the thing that's moved us to the next level.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to close it here, and I'll follow up with each of the panelists. And everybody else, please, if you haven't signed up, send me an email, andrew@futuretide.org, if you haven't signed up for the Google group to continue this conversation, sharing resources, and also to find out about further conversations that may take place. Thank you all. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's good
Thank
to see y'all. Y'all take care now.
All right.